Hello and welcome. I'm Geoff Shullenberger. This is Compact Conversations, the podcast where we sit down with one of Compact's contributors each week to discuss one of our articles. This week, however, we will be turning things around because the article we will be discussing is by me, and instead of interviewing another author, I will be interviewed by our own editor, Matthew Schmitz, who is with me in the studio, and I will now turn it over to Matthew to lead off on this conversation.
Geoff, thanks for having me. It's kind of fun to come here and kind of play at host on your turf. This week you published in Compact a review essay with the title, What BAP Learned From Feminism. BAP, as you inform the reader, is short for Bronze Age Pervert, a kind of well-known personality on social media who's associated with kind of the dissident right or the online right. He has a new book out, not under his own name, but under his real name, Costin Alamariu. The book is titled Selective Breeding and the Birth of Philosophy. It's an adapted version of his PhD thesis at Yale. Geoff, why take the time to review a self-published dissertation?
Well, for one thing, it's shot up into the bestseller category on Amazon over last weekend, right after it was released. It was in the top 100 of all books, which is pretty astonishing. It's now, I believe, number one in ancient Greek history and political philosophy and a few other categories. So it is selling very well. How widely it's actually being read or will be read is perhaps unclear. As far as dissertations go, it is quite lucidly written. It's not, particularly technical, and it's a lively piece of writing. It's not, it's not a sort of dry academic work. So there's that, and in many ways, it is a continuation on the same themes that are central to Bronze Age mindset, which the same author, since now essentially we've determined that Bronze Age Pervert is this person, Costin Alamariu, published in 2018, which is a kind of self-help book, essentially directed at young men, exhorting them to be like the ancient Greeks. So many of the same arguments make their way into, or made their way previously into this dissertation, which has now been published with an introduction that, as he explains it, kind of reframes the dissertation in a somewhat different way than how it was framed in its original form, because he, as he puts it, was kind of trying to, make it respectable within the academic context. Now he can kind of get clear about what he really wants to convey, which really is ultimately this message, and just to simplify the thesis, is that philosophy is born out of the spirit of eugenics. That is essentially the argument of the piece.
Okay, so if we take that philosophies are born out of the spirit of eugenics, I know you'll explain that more for us in a second, but what's the appeal here, right? People are never drawn to something for totally perverse reasons. There has to be some reason that it's getting a wide audience. What is BAP onto? Why have people kind of glommed onto this kind of eugenic proposal of his about breeding and philosophy?
The way I frame it in the review is, and this is a thought I've had about his work for a while, and reading this dissertation really kind of confirmed most of what I had previously concluded, which is that, it really is a kind of direct inversion of many of the claims and assumptions of feminism in various forms, as well as of various kind of ideas we associate with the woke sort of ideological sphere. Or we might say, as I argue in the piece, that it's kind of transvaluation, which would be Nietzsche's term, of various claims that we would actually associate with the left, with feminism and other ideas. So let's take just the basic point that I made before, right? The thesis is that philosophy emerges out of an aristocratic ancient Greek society in which you have a kind of essentially master race of kind of eugenically bred higher specimens of humanity, right? Who kind of elaborate philosophy as a way of kind of defending their privilege by understanding nature. And this is understood as, the notion that humans have a nature. Human beings are fundamentally different based on their breeding, and that therefore the appeal to nature is ultimately an appeal to a kind of natural superiority of these higher men, essentially. What we see here is in a sense very similar to certain claims that you find in the feminist sphere and in various kind of left academic realms, which is that the Western tradition is tainted from its origin with ideas of racial superiority, with phallogocentrism, right? The dominance accorded to the phallus and to kind of, rational thought as elaborated by the ancient Greek philosophers in its first form. Also that Western philosophy is tied in with notions of Western, cultural superiority, and that you can't really separate out, and this would be the kind of left-wing allegation, right? That you can't separate out the Western tradition from its origins in racism, in elitism, in in sort of violent masculine domination and oppression of women. So these are claims that you can find in various realms of feminism and kinds of, radical critical theory for decades. So in a sense, what Alemario does is simply accept all of these claims, right? And say, yes, and all that is good, right? And he more or less says this overtly, right? That people who actually agree with him in his account of what, how philosophy emerges in ancient Greece and what its ultimate nature is, are people who make these claims so as to condemn the West, right? Rather than to essentially praise and single out the West as a kind of space of singular human achievement, as he does. So I think the appeal of it is essentially that in a period of, after decades in which these sort of attacks on the Western tradition have been sort of mainstreamed and been built into much of the dominant culture, he essentially gives us that same story back, but puts a spin on it in which you can essentially embrace all of those allegations and say that in fact all of that is good. So, I mean, this is it's quite counterintuitive on one level. I think appeals to people who are alienated by both, I would say, the dominant kind of left-wing academic and intellectual culture, but at the same time who are no longer persuaded by the kind of conservative peons to some kind of generic Western tradition and some kind of, universal, idea of some kind of universal greatness, right? Which no longer seems particularly plausible, and instead they're actually, more, what's kind of more impressive and more subversive is to, and in the current cultural context, is to, embrace this kind of hard vision of, truly good culture does come out of these quite, violent and terrifying things.
So the myth of the primordial mother, or of primordial matriarchy, the idea that before the advent of Western civilization or what have you, people lived in relatively egalitarian societies governed by feminine mores, where women had a certain pride of place. This is presented in the idiom of the online right as the longhouse, a stultifying vision of leveling and mediocrity. As you explain in your essay, this was idealized by feminist thinkers in the 1970s and was also popularized by them in a kind of kitschy form. What came out of this, the feminist belief in this kind of primordial matriarchy, and how did they seek to participate in that, or recall that history, or participate in that legacy?
Right. And I think one thing that's interesting about Alemario, I mean, he does this in Bronze Age Mindset as well, that sets him apart from, let's say, more standard men's rights and sort of manosphere type thinkers, is that, usually the assumption would be, well, for most of history, men have been in charge, and now we've entered this horrible, perverse time in which, women have somehow turned the tables, and we're all kind of chafing under the unnatural domination of women, right? And so one thing that BAP and, as himself and or that Alemario as BAP and as himself does, is to turn this on his head and say, actually, in a sense, the feminists were right. The origin of human society is this kind of matriarchal one. You live in this kind of egalitarian communal setting. So then the way he frames sort of the West is as a masculine martial society, is as a kind of revolution against this kind of suffocating primordial matriarchy. So the feminists in the 70s and 80s, embraced this idea, right, that patriarchy was not natural. It was not the norm throughout history. In fact, it was a relatively recent historical deviation from the norm, right? And so for the feminists of that time, I think it provided this myth that could solve, certain kind of problems in terms of how women as their possibilities in terms of what they could do with their lives and what roles they could occupy in society. When they looked back at more recent history, what they saw was, seemingly unbroken male domination. There were very few kind of role models or ideas of what women would do in power, right? And so it provided this kind of compensatory myth that, well, if you go back far enough, you can find these societies where for thousands of years women occupied the most important roles, were revered as higher than men, and so on. So it really provided this kind of mythical framework for women at a time when they were trying to kind of renegotiate their position in society in the 70s and 80s. And there were, sort of more highbrow and more lowbrow versions of this, I suppose. I think you can really see, going back to the question of what the appeal of this is, the appeal of this to of the Bronze Age mindset version of history to young men is perhaps comparable, right? Because it sets up this alternative mythology, right, in which they are the kind of potentially heroic warriors fighting against this oppressive system, right, which they claim is now matriarchy. The matriarchy has reasserted itself and has kind of stifled masculine virtue in the modern world. It's worth adding, I mentioned from Julius Evola, who was a reactionary and fascist ideologue, who kind of pointed in this direction as well back in the 30s and 40s, was essentially saying the modern world had become once again this kind of matriarchal nightmare, right, of this domination by this kind of undifferentiated egalitarian mass society. And so it needed to be overturned through the recovery of these kind of martial virtues and sort of masculine distinction.
Okay, so this is a description of ancient kind of prehistoric civilization, right? It's tied to kind of historical claims, based on anthropological speculations, maybe archaeological findings. What's the status of this myth? How true is it?
There's a book by Cynthia Eller from 2000 who's a scholar of religion that kind of reviews these various bodies of literature. The book is called The Myth of Matriarchal Prehistory. Yeah, I think she finds that much of it is at best tendentious. Just to name an example, right? A lot of it is based on the idea that, the image of accompanied the piece on Alamariu's thesis is the Venus, the Willendorf Venus, which is a sort of statue of a extremely voluptuous female figure that dates back seemingly to this early period, 5,000-6,000. So I don't know exactly how many years, but of these kind of agricultural societies, they did produce seemingly a lot of images of these fertile female figures, right? What Eller suggests is the problem with taking this as proof that these are societies in which women, dominated and held all the important social roles is just that you can't conclude all that much about what exactly this meant socially as far as how these societies were organized, just from the fact that they appreciated this kind of symbolism. She also points out that in this time, there was kind of this naive idea that, patriarchy was grounded in having these kind of male god figures. They tended to be associated with, violent masculine qualities, but that in these more kind of peaceful societies, you had these feminine god, deities who were associated with, fertility, reproduction, growth, the harvest. And so that these were much more peaceful societies. What she shows is that if you look at the broader archaeological evidence, it would seem that, people in these supposedly more peaceful matriarchal societies often died of violent death, right? So in other words, the fact that they were attached to this kind of symbolism doesn't necessarily mean that they were particularly peaceful societies, as is often concluded. So the point is, we don't know, these are prehistoric societies. There's a lot we don't and can't know about them. A lot of this is necessarily going to be based on kind of speculation and extrapolation, but her conclusion is that this narrative is quite tendentious and oversimplified at best. But, that it serves certain important kind of ideological purposes, and therefore, in a sense, none of that is going to matter that much if you are hell-bent on believing it because it serves some kind of purpose for you in the present.
The idea of the primordial prehistoric matriarchy maybe doesn't hold up as a strict kind of historical matter. It doesn't gain its appeal, certainly, from pure interest in prehistory. As you say, it has uses today. And you talked a bit about those uses. It's not right. It's not just a claim when we hear about kind of the longhouse or the reign of these mammies. The idea Alamari's writing is not just that the matriarchy once existed, it's that it has been reimposed and that there is a system governing us that is the absolute opposite of what he wants. He wants to invert everything, to erect his society based on strength, glorying in fitness, reveling in hierarchy, disdaining the inferior, all these things. Before you can get to that inversion, I think you have to ask, how accurate is this as a picture of our current society? Obviously, people see something in it, don't they? That a lot of people have taken up this idea of the longhouse. What do they see in it?
Yeah, I think it's complicated because I think there's a lot that can just be kind of ridiculed and dismissed about this, both as a historical account and an account of the present. But I think, basically there's no question, right? There are books by liberal journalists and social scientists basically making the point that various kind of social, economic, and technological shifts have kind of tipped the balance of society towards one in which women and girls seem to thrive much more than men, right? And that, as a result of this, we have generally kind of poor prospects facing a lot of young men, and we have men across much of society, particularly outside of the sort of educated classes, who are, in various ways disaffected and experiencing kind of enemy. So these are all trends, right? That if we want to claim that society has become feminized, again, going back to the 70s feminists, this is a long time claim of figures on the New Left and in feminism that various kinds of kind of social and economic and technological changes were in fact feminizing society, and this is a good thing. I think in more the past 10-15 years, again, you have mainstream liberal and liberal journalists and social scientists writing about how men are generally kind of doing poorly, women are doing a lot better. So that's one kind of way of framing this. That yes, I mean, I think we can say the balance has shifted towards a society in which men have a harder time kind of finding their place.
Right, and that's why you see in, say, elite college admissions, men often have a leg up over women. A relatively unqualified male applicant will be given a boost compared to a woman because there are fewer qualified male applicants. So there's a form of kind of affirmative action being practiced there, reflecting the fact that men aren't generally doing as well as women. They're not coming to that process with the same credentials and accomplishments. That said, do we really, and I would say also there's, the kind of the HR regime, I think, leads to a lot of frustration among people, in the professional class, maybe a lot of the diversity trainings, the this, the that, the, decenter your whiteness, toxic masculinity, detoxify the impurities in your masculinity. All of this, I think, frustrates a lot of people, leads to a lot of impatience, and I think prepares the ground for proposals like BAP's. That said, is it really the case? You get into this in your essay, so I know your answer, but is it really the case that our society is one that embraces weakness, that rejects any kind of social distinctions, one that's opposed to breeding, to a certain eugenic project? I mean, BAP presents his project as very subversive, his pro-eugenic proposal.
Right. So I think this is, in some ways the most interesting question to come out of it. He makes the point that, which I think is true, and I've sort of criticized the kind of taboo around discussion of this subject on similar grounds, that it's one thing to sort of just say that, oh, we can't talk about eugenics, or we should, it's, as soon as you talk about it, you're making it respectable. But the fact is that people still are doing eugenics in various ways.
What ways?
For one thing, screening, prenatal screening. I mean, there was a recent piece, I think, in a major publication just about how, basically the population of people with Down syndrome is, massively decreased simply because they're being aborted. So that would be a simple example. The other example I cite is assortative mating, right, which is just basically people marrying within their own class. This is something sociologists and various observers have made this point over the past few decades, that cliche example is like, it used to be you would often have a boss in a company marry his secretary, right? And so you'd have a certain amount of class mixing, right? Now it's far more likely that somebody who becomes a boss is going to end up married to somebody else who's an executive in another company, right? And so that means that, you actually have kind of less intermingling of the classes, in part because of women pursuing similar professional paths to men. You have a greater likelihood of men and women who are both high achieving, academic and professional people, sort of meritocratic strivers, are going to marry each other. They're going to produce offspring who have those same values and inherit some of those talents and abilities. And therefore, this concept, which again is kind of a cliche of like hereditary meritocracy, right? So you do have a kind of eugenics program, in a sense, that doesn't describe itself that way, and that, who's the people who are in that world are very uncomfortable talking about this. But the fact is, if you just observe what they're doing, it would seem that that is kind of how they're approaching things.
Your argument is that BAP wants a kind of high IQ elite that is generally white, kind of ruling over a more mixed race population. An elite that keeps its blood pure by abortion or infanticide, by getting rid of the deformed or the disabled, but also perpetuates its privilege by marrying other kind of high IQ, high status people. So that's what BAP wants, and you're saying we kind of have a version of that.
Right, we have a version of it. The problem is that it's increasingly multiracial, but it's, if you consider that a lot of it is kind of drawn from the sort of cognitive elites of every nation in the world, right, want to come to the United States, want to be able to work here, want to have their children grow up here.
It is increasingly multiracial. It would be less diverse, I think, than the population at large.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So if we have something that...
also more, I would say more Asian as well, right?
Okay. More Asian. Right. Good. So if we already have a kind of, at least a fair approximation of what he wants, what's really the complaint? Is the complaint just that we aren't, that they don't drop hard R's often enough, or what?
Well, I mean, this is sort of the interesting thing, right? I think the complaint that would perhaps be legitimate is that our culture kind of sucks, like that we're not producing interesting works of literature, art, etc. And so the claim here would
seems largely true, I think.
Yeah, well, I think that's true.
Yeah.
So the claim is, okay, ancient Greece, produces a remarkable amount of incredible, enduring art, literature, philosophy. And so the claim is sort of that, this comes out of or is the hard-won product of this kind of, centuries-long process of breeding this elite, which, concentrates all of this talent. And so, I suppose, that's part of the idea. But again, I suppose what's kind of interesting here is I think it's fair to say we're not living in a great age of culture, although I think American culture over the past 100 years has had periods of producing quite notable and historically significant cultural output, and often not because, and in fact, without getting too deeply into it, much of that kind of came from the process by which this kind of older hereditary, let's say, WASP elite kind of gave way to these other groups that were sort of contesting the culturally preeminent status of the country's kind of older elite and kind of making their mark in significant ways on the culture. What I say towards the end of the piece is, I think it's probably true that there are certain times at which these kind of aristocratic, these highly caste stratified societies with, more or less racially homogeneous aristocratic elites have contributed a great deal to the heritage of sort of world culture. At the same time, I think those types of societies have often gone centuries of producing only mediocrity, and kind of more, more democratic societies have produced, quite a bit of interesting stuff themselves. This actually ties back to another piece we published about why right-wing people in the same sort of sphere as Alamaru are obsessed with alternative theories of Shakespeare authorship. The simple reason for that is that the alternative theories of Shakespeare authorship tend to posit a sort of well-bred aristocrat as the author of Shakespeare's work, as opposed to the actual historical William Shakespeare, who was a kind of, vulgar lower class guy who, didn't have particularly impressive breeding or credentials. And so, I think my own take would sort of be, it's probably it's not worth denying that some of the great golden ages of culture have been ones that more or less match what Almario describes. That those kind of societies have often also stagnated into mediocrity, and at the same time, more democratic societies have also experienced golden ages of human creativity. And because I'm a William Shakespeare wrote the works of William Shakespeare partisan, I will give that as an example.
So I think it's worth kind of asking or thinking a bit about the response to Bronze Age Pervert and his project. In light of your argument, he's widely attacked. I don't think that any mainstream or publication has received his ideas sympathetically. But according to your argument, there actually maybe are things in his ideas that liberals don't per se disagree with, or at least they're willing to practice, even if they are reluctant to affirm. What's going on there?
Well, I think he's sort of accepting much of the feminist, decolonial, anti-Western narrative, but simply inverting the values. I think it makes sense that he is sort of a product of era that we live in, because, and he frames his project as one that is about forcing us to reconsider the questions that are most taboo, right? Which would be sort of the question of eugenics, of breeding, right? His gambit is to kind of force a choice between what he sort of mythopoetically and very much in line with these kind of feminist mythologies of an earlier time posits as kind of the longhouse versus the kind of Aryan war band, right? That our only two choices are this kind of ostensible sort of matriarchal socialist egalitarianism, or this kind of cruel, brutal, aristocratic, imperialist and martial set of values. And so, in a sense, he accepts the two choices that were often given by sort of mainstream liberal culture, which is basically, sort of you're with us or you're a fascist. And so, if you're given that choice, then perhaps you will opt for being, as many of his enthusiasts and followers seem to, you will simply opt for being a fascist.
You said that the feminists who articulated their own version of the myth of prehistoric matriarchy, that there were higher brow and lower brow versions of this. What were the lowbrow ones?
Probably self-published books, or books published by these kind of small esoteric presses, helping you to rediscover the true kind of goddess religions of the past, and ritual practices you might revive from them, and kinds of symbolism that you might incorporate into your your daily life. And that an interesting one is that you had these tour companies where you could go and visit these archaeological sites that supposedly would help you get into contact with these things. And then Dan Brown's The Da Vinci Code, right, which people may recall, essentially gives a version of the same story, right? In the beginning, you had this kind of ancient Mediterranean, cult of, kind of goddess cult. Then, this is ultimately kind of destroyed and overthrown and persecuted into near extinction by the rise of sort of Judeo-Christian monotheism. And so, this basic idea that you get in the Dan Brown novel is really another kind of pop version of this narrative. Brown notably claims that, originally Jesus was actually an adherent of this, and that Mary Magdalene was kind of the embodiment of the divine feminine, and then that, the kind of evil patriarchal forces that took over the church, destroyed the true story of its origins and replaced it with this kind of male-dominated version. So this is, an example of how this basic narrative has continued to have appeal well beyond the kind of 70s and 80s kind of goddess-worshipping feminism stuff.
So I think one challenge, and it's kind of fun to watch for people who are interacting with BAP and his ideas, is just trying to figure out how seriously should we take him, because his tone is playful, ironic, but clearly he also demands to be taken seriously. He it advances striking ideas, and I think maybe we'll just kind of set that to the side. But I do think there are some parallels between today's kind of dissident or online right and that kind of pop feminism you were just describing. There's a publisher associated with this milieu, Imperium Press, and they have an edition of the Poetic Edda, the very important body of Norse poetry that is one of the sources for Wagner's Ring Cycles. And the edition they publish has an introduction they boast from a, quote, living practitioner of the Norse religion, giving us deeper insight into the worldview and religious spirit that animates the poems. So there's this idea that you can participate in an authentic and primordial thing. It's Norse religion, which of course doesn't have an unbroken lineage. May have sincere practitioners today, but they're not part of an unbroken tradition by any stretch of the imagination. And the notion that they're in touch with the original spirit of the poems is probably open to challenge. You really raise the question at the end of your essay, controversies surrounding this book, its author. Do they about just kind of social currents and their kind of sometimes kitschy expression, or is there a kind of lasting body of work here that'll be read and by kind of non-historians in 50 years' time?
Yeah, I'm not sure. As I said, I think certainly as far as and Bronze Age mindset is worth saying is, it's essentially written as a kind of it's somewhat imitative of Nietzsche in formal terms, although it's written in his kind of sort of caveman dialect. But it does have this kind of it has this quality of being a kind of Nietzsche fanfic type work. So I think in that sense it doesn't. It presents itself as a kind of ephemera, like it really is a kind of fanfic, and I don't think he's necessarily presenting it as anything other, although certainly it's had some admirers who have claimed otherwise. I think as far as the book that's just come out that I'm writing about primarily here, it's a bit ambiguous, right? I think it's probably in terms of its interpretation of, I'm not sure if this will happen, but in terms of its interpretation of Plato and Nietzsche, it certainly makes some interesting and provocative points that are probably would be worth people seriously engaging with. I kind of doubt that will happen just because in a sense he's right that there is a great deal of taboo around all of this, and particularly because of it now being associated with him and his online persona. So that means, the question of what exactly this book is supposed to achieve is kind of an open-ended one. I attempted in my own way to just sort of take it relatively seriously as an intellectual project and, treat it as what it presents itself as, which is a serious attempt to, think through a fundamental question of how philosophy originated. So I think it deserves to be read and evaluated on those terms. He's generally prone to making both kind of grandiose claims about its significance while at the same time kind of retreating behind a veil of irony and jokes and shit posting and so on.
Well, I'm glad that you took the book seriously and explored some of the ideas therein. I encourage listeners to go to compactmag.com and to read What BAP Learned from Feminism.
All right. So thanks for all that, Matthew. And as you said, this one is behind the paywall. So please do subscribe if you haven't to read it. And stay tuned next week for the next installment. Thank you.